In the midst of war, there are moments that can change everything. Dr. Samuel Johnson stood in the quiet of the dimly lit tent, the smell of antiseptic hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the camp was buzzing with the typical sounds of a wartime prison. Distant voices, the clatter of boots on gravel, the murmur of soldiers carrying out their duties. But inside, it was different. Inside, it was all about the people. The prisoners. The lives that had been shattered and now lay before him, waiting for a chance to heal. His eyes moved from the small stack of medical charts to the woman sitting before him. Her name was Margarete Müller, a German prisoner of war who had been brought here with dozens of other women, all part of a program to help with the labor shortage on American farms. She sat there, her hands trembling slightly, eyes downcast, the weight of months spent in captivity written in the deep lines on her face. Dr. Johnson had seen this before. The fear, the uncertainty, the trauma. But there was something different about her. Something in the way she held herself. It was as though she had already given up on the world, resigned to her fate. He picked up his pen, ready to begin his examination, but the words of his mentor from medical school echoed in his mind. Every patient is a person first, and that means you treat them with respect, no matter their circumstances. Margaret's body was frail, her skin pale from months of malnutrition. But it wasn't just her physical state that stood out to him. It was the emptiness in her eyes, the quiet resignation. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a person who had lost everything. Family, home, country. Dr. Johnson's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Margaret's voice. "I do not need your help," she said in a hoarse whisper, still not looking up. "I will die soon anyway. What is the point?" He paused, looking at her with empathy. He knew what she meant. He had seen it in the eyes of other prisoners. That same hopelessness that seemed to swallow them whole. But he couldn't let that happen to her. Not on his watch. He stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "You're not going to die," he said firmly, meeting her gaze for the first time. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Dr. Johnson thought for a moment, then placed his hand on the edge of the table. "Because I've seen what kindness can do. I've seen it change lives. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Change your life." Margaret blinked, as though the words didn't quite register at first. For a moment, the air between them seemed to shift. She was still skeptical, but something in her softened, just a fraction. He began his examination, his movements careful and precise, but always with a sense of compassion. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she flinched whenever he touched her arm, but he didn't back off. He couldn't afford to. "You're very sick," he said quietly, scanning her chart. "But there's something I can do. I'm not going to give up on you." As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the promise hanging in the air between them. He wasn't just talking about medicine. He was talking about hope. And as Dr. Johnson continued his examination, he couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, this prisoner, was about to prove something to him. Something that would change both of their lives forever. Dr. Samuel Johnson sat quietly in the corner of the small tent, the dim light from a single bulb hanging overhead casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the world seemed a million miles away, distant and cold, filled with the echoes of war that had torn everything apart. But here, in this quiet space, the stillness was filled with something else. Something delicate. Something that had the potential to heal. Margaret sat on the other side of the room, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap, a distant look in her eyes as she gazed at the floor. She had listened to Dr. Johnson's words, the promise he had made, but the doubts still lingered in her. She had been told so many lies by her captors. She had been promised safety, only to find herself behind barbed wire. She had been promised food, only to be left starving. She had been promised hope, only to see it crushed under the weight of her circumstances. But here, Dr. Johnson had said something different. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't offering empty promises. He had offered something real, his help, his time, his belief that she could recover. Margaret didn't know what to make of it. She had seen so much pain in her life. How could she trust him? How could she believe that this man, a doctor, could change anything for her? She had seen what humans could do to one another. She had seen the devastation of war. Yet, in his eyes, she saw something that felt almost foreign. Something like kindness. Something that made her question everything she thought she knew. I will do everything I can to help you, Dr. Johnson repeated, his voice soft but firm. You are not just a number to me. You're a person, and that means you deserve better than this. His words hung in the air between them, fragile yet strong, like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to feel the tiniest flicker of hope. It was barely a spark, but it was there, hidden beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion. She could not let herself believe in it fully, but it was enough to make her feel something different. Dr. Johnson stepped closer, reaching for the medical supplies he had laid out earlier. His hands moved with practiced precision, yet there was something gentle in his touch, something that made Margaret feel like she wasn't just another patient to be checked off a list. He wasn't just doing his job. He was there, in that moment, for her. He knelt down beside her, carefully assessing her condition. Her body was weak, frail from the months of mistreatment and neglect, but there was something about her that told him she wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. You've been through more than most people could imagine, Dr. Johnson said quietly, as he checked her pulse. But you're still here. That says something. You still have a fight in you. Margaret met his gaze for the first time since their conversation began. His eyes were warm, not cold like the men who had guarded her in the past. There was no judgment, no disdain in his eyes, just a quiet understanding. For the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret felt seen. She felt like she wasn't invisible, like she wasn't just another casualty of war. What if I can't do it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm too far gone? Dr. Johnson shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're not too far gone, he said softly. You're here, and that's all that matters. The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It wasn't filled with fear or doubt. It was filled with something else. Something new. Hope. Dr. Johnson moved to prepare the treatment, his focus unbroken, but his mind was on Margaret. He could see the war had taken so much from her, her health, her spirit, her belief in kindness. But he also saw something in her that made him believe she could recover. He wasn't just treating her physical wounds. He was treating her soul. As the days passed, Dr. Johnson continued to care for Margaret. Each visit brought small improvements, both in her health and in her outlook on life. She began to trust him more, and with that trust came the smallest hints of a smile. She began to share stories of her life before the war, of her family, her home in Germany, and the quiet moments she had once taken for granted. Slowly but surely, the walls Margaret had built around herself began to crumble. Dr. Johnson never pushed her. He just listened, allowing her to open up when she was ready. And with each word, with each small step forward, Margaret began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could heal. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks. There were moments of doubt. But there was also something else. There was hope. It wasn't something Margaret had expected to find in a war-torn camp in the middle of nowhere. But it was there, in the quiet care of a doctor who refused to give up on her. And with that hope came the possibility of something even greater. Her chance at life, her chance at recovery, her chance at a future. Dr. Johnson knew that it wasn't just his medical knowledge that had saved Margaret. It was his belief in her, his unwavering commitment to treating her as more than just a prisoner, but as a person deserving of dignity and care. And that was something that no amount of medicine could ever replace. Dr. Samuel Johnson stood at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the line of trees, casting an orange glow over the barren land. He had seen many things during his time as a doctor, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that had stirred something deep within him, pulling him into a story far beyond medicine. Margaret had come to him as a broken soul, a woman whose life had been torn apart by war. But now, with each passing day, she was slowly healing, not just physically, but emotionally as well. It had been weeks since they had first met, and Dr. Johnson had watched her transform before his eyes. She was no longer just a patient. She had become someone he cared for deeply. It was a quiet connection, one that neither of them had expected. The small moments they shared, an exchange of a smile, a brief conversation about the weather, a shared laugh over something trivial, had become the foundation of something more. They were building trust. And with that trust came something neither of them had anticipated, hope. It was something that had been missing in Margaret's life for far too long. And now, it was something she was beginning to feel again. As Dr. Johnson made his way back to the small clinic tent, his thoughts lingered on the changes he had seen in her. She was gaining strength, both physically and mentally. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks, her hands no longer trembling as they had when he first met her. But there was something else. Something in her eyes that told him she was ready to move forward. "Dr. Johnson," Margaret called out as he entered the tent. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her posture straighter than it had been when he first examined her. She smiled slightly as he entered, and for a moment, he felt a rush of pride. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with genuine concern. "Better," she replied, her voice still soft, but there was a hint of strength behind it now. "The pain is almost gone." Dr. Johnson nodded, pleased to hear it. He had known that the physical healing would take time, but seeing Margaret regain her confidence was even more important. "That's good to hear," he said, moving to her side to check her vitals once more. As he did, Margaret looked up at him, her expression serious. "Dr. Johnson," she said quietly, I don't know what I would have done without you." Dr. Johnson paused, glancing at her as she spoke. Her words caught him off guard. He had grown used to seeing patients, to helping them recover, but this was different. Margaret wasn't just expressing gratitude. She was acknowledging the bond they had formed, a bond that went beyond the confines of doctor and patient. It was a connection rooted in mutual respect, in understanding, and in something that felt almost like friendship. "You did all the hard work," Dr. Johnson replied, trying to downplay his role. "I just helped guide you." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice firming. "You saved my life. You gave me a chance." Dr. Johnson felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't often that a patient's words had such an impact on him. But in that moment, he realized just how deeply he had come to care for Margaret. It wasn't just about the medicine anymore. It was about her as a person. It was about the small victories, the first smile, the first sign of trust, the first moment when she started to believe in herself again. "You're stronger than you think," Dr. Johnson said softly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "And you're not alone anymore." Margaret's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something deeper there, a spark of hope that had long been extinguished. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Dr. Johnson smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I never will." As the days passed, Margaret continued to recover. Her physical strength returned, and her spirit was slowly rebuilt. The walls she had erected around herself began to crumble, piece by piece, as she learned to trust again. She no longer saw herself as just a prisoner of war, but as a person capable of healing, capable of moving forward. And for Dr. Johnson, the journey had been equally transformative. He had come to this camp to do his duty, to help those who had been wounded and broken by the horrors of war. But in helping Margaret, he had found something unexpected. He had found a reminder of the power of compassion, the power of human connection. As he continued to care for Margaret, he knew that this was more than just a job. It was a calling. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Johnson felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Dr. Samuel Johnson stood in the small tent, watching the sun set behind the wire fences of the camp. It had been a long day of medical examinations, but something about today felt different. Margaret was improving. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke. There was a quiet strength in her now that hadn't been there when they first met. And it wasn't just physical strength. It was something deeper. It was a belief that she could heal. He had seen that spark in her eyes a few days ago, the first sign that the hope he had offered her was beginning to take root. He had worked with countless patients before, but this felt personal. Margaret had become more than just a patient. She had become someone he cared about, someone he was determined to help. As he turned to leave the tent, he saw her standing by the door, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. "Dr. Johnson," Margaret called, her voice soft but clear. He smiled, walking over to her. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice gentle. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Better," she said, her eyes meeting his. "The pain is almost gone. I feel stronger." Dr. Johnson's heart swelled with pride. It had been a difficult journey for her, but seeing her recover, seeing her find herself again, made every long hour worth it. "That's good to hear," he said, his voice full of encouragement. "You've been through a lot, but you're doing great." Margaret nodded, her expression serious. I I never thought this was possible, she said quietly. I thought I was too broken. Dr. Johnson shook his head, his gaze soft. You're not broken, Margaret. You're just healing. It takes time, but you're getting there. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. You've done more than I could have ever imagined. The words caught him off guard. He had never expected her to say something like that. He had always seen himself as just doing his job. But in that moment, he realized that what he was doing here was about more than medicine. It was about making a difference in someone's life. It was about showing kindness and compassion when everything else in the world seemed cold and distant. I just did what anyone would do, Dr. Johnson replied, trying to brush it off, but his voice faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being thanked, especially not like this. Margaret smiled softly, her gaze never leaving his. Not everyone would do what you did, she said quietly. Not everyone would care. Her words lingered in the air, hanging between them. Dr. Johnson felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet recognition that what he was doing mattered. It mattered to her. And that was enough. Over the next few days, Margaret's recovery continued at a steady pace. Her strength returned, and with it, her sense of self. She began to laugh again, a small but meaningful step toward reclaiming the parts of herself that war had taken from her. Dr. Johnson continued to visit her regularly, each time finding her in better spirits. Their conversations shifted from the medical to the personal, as they shared stories of their lives before the war. Margaret spoke of her family, her home in Germany, and the life she had once known. Dr. Johnson listened, offering words of comfort and understanding, but he also shared his own stories. His memories of growing up on a farm in rural America, the long days of hard work, the simple pleasures of life. It was in these small moments, these quiet exchanges, that their bond grew stronger. As Margaret healed, she began to see Dr. Johnson not just as a doctor, but as someone who had shown her the kindness she had long since forgotten existed. She had been so lost in the darkness of war, in the devastation of what had been taken from her, that she had forgotten there could be light again. But now, with each passing day, she was beginning to believe in that light. She was beginning to believe in herself again. One afternoon, as Dr. Johnson was preparing to leave for the day, Margaret stopped him. Dr. Johnson, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to thank you for everything. He turned to face her, his expression softening. There's no need to thank me, he said, his voice kind. You've done all the hard work. I'm just here to help. Margaret shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. No, she said firmly. You've done more than help. You've given me a chance to live, to heal, to start again. Dr. Johnson felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at her. He had never imagined that this would be the outcome when he first met her. He had expected to treat her wounds, to help her get better physically. But he hadn't anticipated how deeply her recovery would affect him, how it would change his view of the world. I'm glad I could help, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You deserve it, Margaret. You deserve everything good that comes your way. In that moment, Dr. Johnson realized that their journey together wasn't just about healing the body. It was about restoring hope, about finding light in the darkest of times. And as he watched Margaret smile, he knew that no matter what happened in the future, they had both found something worth holding on to, something that would stay with them long after the war had ended. Dr. Samuel Johnson had always been a man of action, someone who believed in doing rather than talking. But as the days passed, and Margaret continued to recover, he found himself wondering if there was something more to his role here than just healing wounds and prescribing medicine. He had come to this camp with a singular purpose, to help those in need. But now, watching Margaret slowly regain her strength, he felt a deeper connection to her story. It was not just about the healing of her body. It was about the healing of her spirit. He had seen how war could break a person, how it could shatter their sense of hope, their belief in humanity. But Margaret was different. She was a survivor, someone who had seen the worst of what the world could offer and had still managed to hold on to the smallest spark of hope. Dr. Johnson admired her for that. He had watched her go from a broken woman, full of fear and doubt, to someone who was beginning to believe in herself again. She laughed more often now, a genuine laugh that came from a place of warmth and trust. He had seen her smile for the first time a few days ago, and it had struck him harder than any of the medical breakthroughs he had achieved. She had smiled, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It was as if the weight of the world had lifted off her shoulders, even if only for a moment. And for Dr. Johnson, that smile meant everything. It meant that all the hours he had spent tending to her, all the conversations they had shared, all the moments of quiet understanding, it all meant something. As the days went by, their bond grew stronger. Dr. Johnson found himself looking forward to his visits with Margaret. It wasn't just about the medical checks anymore. It was about the connection they had built, the friendship that had slowly blossomed between them. One afternoon, as he walked to her tent, he saw her standing by the door, looking out at the wide, open sky. The camp was quiet, the usual sounds of soldiers and machinery distant, as if the world outside had paused just for a moment. Margaret turned when she heard him approaching, her eyes bright as she smiled. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice light, almost playful. "You always seem to arrive just when I need a reason to smile." He chuckled softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'm just doing my job," he replied with a grin. "But if it helps, I'm happy to be the reason for your smile." She stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "You've done more than that," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've given me something I thought I had lost forever." Dr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What's that?" he asked. Margaret's gaze held his, and for a moment, the noise of the camp seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet of the moment. "Hope," she said simply. "You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that life could still have meaning, even after everything that's happened." Dr. Johnson felt his heart swell with emotion. He hadn't expected to hear those words from her. He had always believed that hope was something people had to find for themselves, that he could only help them along the way. But hearing Margaret speak those words, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been the one to help her find it. "I didn't give it to you, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You found it yourself. I just helped you see it." She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You helped me believe it was possible. You showed me that there is still good in the world, that not everyone is like the ones who have hurt me." Dr. Johnson was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed in the goodness of people, but he had never fully understood how powerful that belief could be until he saw it reflected in someone else. It wasn't just about the medicine. It wasn't just about healing wounds. It was about giving someone the strength to believe in themselves again. And that was something far greater than anything he could have ever learned in a textbook. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret," he said quietly, his voice full of admiration. "You've come a long way, and you're going to keep going. I know that for a fact." Her smile widened, and for the first time since he had met her, Dr. Johnson saw the confidence in her that had once been so hard to find. She had come through the darkest of times, and now, she was walking into the light. As the days passed, Dr. Johnson continued to visit Margaret, each time finding her in a better state, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She had become a symbol of resilience to him, a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't just about healing the body. It was about healing the soul. And as Margaret stood there, looking at him with a new sense of purpose in her eyes, he knew that their journey together wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that they both had the strength to face whatever came next. Dr. Samuel Johnson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he observed Margaret over the days that followed. Each time he saw her, there was a noticeable difference. She had gone from a woman broken by the horrors of war to someone who was beginning to rediscover the parts of herself she thought she had lost forever. The camp, with its coldness and its daily routine, had not been kind to her, but now it seemed like a backdrop for her rebirth. A new kind of strength had taken root in her, and with that strength came a courage she hadn't known she possessed. He had watched her smile more, her eyes gleaming with a spark of life. The weight of the past still lingered in her, but it no longer defined her. And Dr. Johnson, in his quiet way, knew that he had helped her get to this point. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Yet, as the days wore on, he realized that their journey together had become more than just about physical recovery. They had shared so much in the last few weeks: stories, memories, moments of connection, that it had become impossible to ignore the bond they had forged. Dr. Johnson didn't know exactly when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Margaret simply as a patient. He had started to see her as a person, someone whose strength and resilience had touched him in a way that no textbook or medical procedure ever could. One morning, as he walked toward the tent where Margaret was staying, he felt the usual quiet excitement that had begun to fill him during these visits. It wasn't just his professional duty that motivated him anymore. It was the genuine connection they had built. As he approached, he saw her standing near the edge of the camp, looking out over the open fields. The sunlight bathed her in a soft glow, and for a moment, he just watched her. There was something peaceful about the way she stood there, as if the weight of her past had finally started to lift, even if just for a little while. She turned when she heard him, and her face lit up with a smile. "Good morning, Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice warm, yet still holding a softness he had come to cherish. "Morning, Margaret," he replied, his smile matching hers. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she said, and he noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she stood taller than she had before. It was as if every part of her was coming alive again. "I'm feeling stronger every day." He nodded, pleased. "That's good to hear. I can see it in you, too." She smiled again, a little more knowingly this time. "I've been thinking about what you said. About hope. You know, when you first told me that I could get better, I didn't believe it. I didn't see how it was possible." Dr. Johnson took a step closer, carefully observing her as she spoke. "And now?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Now," she paused, her eyes reflecting the vastness of the sky behind her. "I think I understand. Hope isn't something someone gives you. It's something you find for yourself. But sometimes, you just need someone to show you it's still there." Her words struck him deeply. He had never thought of it that way before. He had always believed that he was helping to restore hope, but here she was, telling him that it wasn't just his efforts. It was her own strength, too. "You're right," Dr. Johnson said softly, the weight of her words resonating with him. "Hope is something we all have to find inside ourselves. But sometimes, it takes someone else to remind us of it." She nodded thoughtfully, as if she had finally come to a realization she had been avoiding for so long. "I think," she began, her voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. "I think I'm ready to live again. Not just to survive, but to actually live." His heart swelled with pride at her words. "I've always known you had it in you, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been through more than most people could even imagine. But you're still here, still fighting. That's what matters." A silence hung between them for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, one filled with understanding and mutual respect. "I still have a long way to go," Margaret said, her voice quieter now. "But I feel like I'm starting to find myself again." Dr. Johnson smiled, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. "You're not alone in that," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "You've come this far, and I know you'll keep going. One step at a time." As they stood there together, looking out over the camp, Dr. Johnson realized that he had come to care for Margaret in a way that was beyond the boundaries of his role as a doctor. He wasn't just her healer anymore. He was someone who had witnessed her transformation, someone who had been there for her when she needed it most. And in return, she had given him a gift he never expected, the understanding that the true power of healing lies not just in medicine, but in the connections we make with others. As the sun continued to rise, casting its warm light over the camp, Dr. Johnson knew that he had helped Margaret find the strength to start anew. But more than that, she had helped him rediscover the purpose that had brought him to this place in the first place, to heal, to care, and to remind others that hope is always worth holding on to. As the days passed, the air in the camp seemed to grow lighter, almost as if it too was catching a glimpse of the changes taking place within Margaret. The transformation in her was undeniable. When Dr. Samuel Johnson first met her, she had been a shell of the woman she once was. Now, as the days turned into weeks, there was something undeniably different about her. Her strength was no longer a quiet, hidden force. It was now a part of her, visible in the way she carried herself, in the way she interacted with others. Margaret was no longer just a survivor. She was thriving. There was a spark in her eyes, a new sense of confidence that had been missing before. Dr. Johnson had always believed in the power of the human spirit to overcome the darkest of circumstances, but seeing it firsthand, in Margaret, had reinforced his faith in that belief. She had been through more than most people could imagine. Her body had been broken, her spirit crushed. Yet, she had fought back. She had chosen to rise, to take the steps toward healing, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. It was a long road, one filled with moments of doubt, fear, and even setbacks. But each step she took was a testament to her resilience. Dr. Johnson continued to visit her every day, his role shifting slowly from that of a caregiver to someone who was simply there to support her. He no longer saw her just as a patient in need of healing. He saw her as a person, someone he deeply respected, someone who had taught him as much about strength as he had taught her about medicine. One afternoon, as Dr. Johnson arrived at the tent where Margaret had been staying, he noticed something different. The camp, which had always felt like a temporary and almost foreign place to him, now seemed to take on a new meaning. The harshness of the war that lingered in the background was still present, but the environment was changing. The once sterile, impersonal surroundings now felt warmer. It was as though the hope Margaret had found had begun to infuse the very air they breathed. As he entered the tent, he saw her sitting on the small cot, a book in her hands. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes bright, a small smile on her lips. "Good afternoon, Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice steady, the warmth in it unmistakable. He returned her smile, his heart lifting. "Afternoon, Margaret," he replied. "How are you today?" "Better," she answered, her eyes sparkling. "I've been reading. It helps clear my mind." Dr. Johnson nodded, his gaze softening. "That's good," he said. "Reading can be a great escape." Margaret smiled at him, her fingers brushing the pages of the book in her hands. "It reminds me of a time before all of this," she said softly. "Before everything changed." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding. They both knew what she meant. The war had taken so much from her, and from so many others. But now, through small moments like this, she was beginning to reclaim pieces of her life. Dr. Johnson could see it in the way she spoke, in the way she was able to share her thoughts with him now. "You're getting stronger every day," he said quietly. "I can see it in you." Margaret looked up at him, her smile widening. "I feel it, too," she replied, her voice full of conviction. "I never thought this would happen. But here I am. And I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living again." Dr. Johnson's heart swelled with pride at her words. It wasn't just the physical healing that had taken place. It was the emotional and mental healing. It was the way she was reclaiming her sense of self, her confidence, and her future. For so long, Margaret had been trapped in the past, haunted by the trauma of war and loss. But now, she was finding a way to move forward, one step at a time. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the weight of everything she had been through would threaten to pull her back down. But she was no longer the woman she had been when she first arrived at the camp. She was someone new, someone who had found her strength again. Dr. Johnson could see that now. He could see the spark of life in her that had been dormant for so long. And in that moment, he realized something. Margaret wasn't just healing because of the medicine he had given her. She was healing because of her own will to survive, to move past the scars of war. She was healing because she had chosen to believe in herself again. "I'm proud of you, Margaret," Dr. Johnson said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've come so far, and I know you're going to keep going." Margaret's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." There was a pause, a quiet moment between them, as they both realized how far they had come. And in that silence, Dr. Johnson understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. Healing wasn't just about mending wounds. It was about rebuilding lives, about helping people find their way back to themselves after everything had been torn apart. Margaret had done that. And in doing so, she had taught him more than he could have ever learned in a classroom. She had reminded him of the true power of hope, of resilience, and of the strength that lies within every person to rise again, no matter the circumstances. The camp was quieter than usual, the sounds of distant chatter replaced by an unusual calmness. Dr. Samuel Johnson walked through the camp's dusty path, the weight of the day ahead pressing gently against his shoulders. He had come to this place with a singular mission, to heal. But somewhere along the way, he had learned that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about understanding. It was about connection. As the days went on, Dr. Johnson found himself growing more and more impressed with Margaret's transformation. She had been through so much, yet now, she was a picture of strength, standing tall in the face of her past. The past few weeks had not just been about physical recovery for her. It had been about rediscovering herself. One afternoon, Dr. Johnson arrived at the tent to find Margaret sitting by the window, a soft breeze rustling the pages of her journal. She turned to face him as he entered, a peaceful smile on her face. "Hello, Dr. Johnson." She greeted him warmly, setting the journal aside. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he replied, smiling back at her. "How are you today?" "Better," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About the past, about what's come before, and what's to come." Dr. Johnson nodded, walking over to the small table where she sat. "That's a lot to think about," he said, his voice steady, understanding. "But it's good to reflect. Sometimes we need to look back to see how far we've come." Margaret looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "I never thought I'd get to this point. I thought the past would hold me back forever, that the weight of everything would be too much. But now, I can see that it's not the past that defines me. It's how I choose to move forward." Dr. Johnson felt a surge of pride for her. "You've come a long way, Margaret," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "And you're stronger than you know. But you're not alone in this. You've found your strength again, and I've been lucky enough to witness it." Margaret smiled, her gaze softening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me that there was still hope, even when I couldn't see it myself." Dr. Johnson shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "You did the hard work, Margaret. You found the strength to heal. I just helped you along the way." For a moment, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, the connection between them palpable. Margaret had come so far, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. She had reclaimed her sense of self, her identity, and that was something no one could take from her. It was something she had done for herself. "I've been writing more," Margaret said after a while, her voice breaking the silence. "It helps me put everything into perspective. It's like I'm piecing together who I was and who I'm becoming." Dr. Johnson nodded, understanding the healing power of expression. "Writing can be a powerful tool," he said. "It allows us to process our thoughts, our emotions, and everything we've been through. It helps us understand ourselves better." "Yes," Margaret agreed, her voice soft but determined. "It's like giving my story back to me. And with each word, I feel more like the person I was before. I'm not just a prisoner of war. I'm more than that." Dr. Johnson smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "You've always been more than that, Margaret. You just had to remember it." The days turned into weeks, and Margaret continued to grow stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. She had begun to find her place in the camp, reaching out to the other women who were still struggling. She had become a source of strength for them, a living testament to the power of resilience. Dr. Johnson had always believed in the healing power of human connection, but Margaret had shown him just how powerful it could be. She had transformed, not just in the way she looked or felt, but in the way she viewed herself. She had found peace within herself, something that could never be taken away. One day, as Dr. Johnson approached the tent, he saw Margaret standing outside, looking up at the sky. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the camp. He walked up beside her, and for a moment, they simply stood together in silence, taking in the beauty of the moment. "I'm glad I'm here," Margaret said softly, breaking the quiet. "I'm glad I'm still here, still fighting." Dr. Johnson turned to her, his expression full of admiration. "You've come so far, Margaret," he said, his voice sincere. "You've found your strength again. You're not just surviving. You're living." She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," she said quietly. "Thank you for showing me that I could believe in myself." Dr. Johnson placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze warm. "You were always capable of this, Margaret," he said softly. "You just needed someone to remind you." And in that moment, as the sun set behind them, Dr. Johnson knew that the journey they had both started so many weeks ago had led them to something more than just recovery. It had led them to a place of healing, of hope, and of new beginnings. Dr. Samuel Johnson stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the dusty earth. It had been several months since he first arrived, and each day, the weight of his role in the camp seemed to grow. He had come as a doctor, a man sworn to heal and help those in need. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, he realized that his work here was about much more than medicine. It was about life itself, and it was about people like Margaret. Over time, Dr. Johnson had seen her evolve from a woman who barely spoke to one who had regained her strength, her will, and most importantly, her hope. When he first treated her, she had been broken, physically weak, and emotionally shattered by the horrors of war. But now, when he looked at her, he saw someone different. Someone who had fought through the darkest of times and had emerged on the other side with a newfound purpose. The transformation had been slow, but it had been real. Every day, Margaret grew stronger, not just in her body, but in her soul. She had started talking more, sharing stories from her past, and opening up to the people around her. She had even begun helping others in the camp, offering comfort and support to those who were still struggling. It was a quiet strength, but it was unmistakable. She had become a symbol of hope for others, a living testament to what was possible even after the darkest of experiences. One afternoon, as Dr. Johnson walked through the camp, he saw her standing near the fence, looking out at the open field. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment, she looked as though she were in another world, her thoughts far from the camp and the war that had brought them here. He approached her slowly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment she seemed to be having. "Hey, Margaret," he said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet air. She turned to face him, and her face lit up with a smile. "Dr. Johnson." She greeted him warmly, as if the distance between them was no more than a few steps. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," he agreed, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before them. "Sometimes, it's easy to forget how beautiful the world can be when you're caught up in everything else." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know exactly what you mean. For a long time, I couldn't see the beauty in anything. Everything just felt like it was breaking apart, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. But now I can see it again. I can see the small things. The way the wind moves through the trees. The way the light hits the ground. The way the world keeps going, no matter what happens." Dr. Johnson watched her, feeling a deep sense of admiration for how far she had come. She had lost so much, her home, her family, everything she had known. Yet she had found a way to keep moving forward. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about living again. "You've come so far, Margaret," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "You've fought through so much, and now you're seeing the world in a way that few ever do. That's something incredible." She smiled, a soft, grateful smile that made Dr. Johnson's heart swell with warmth. "I don't think I could have done it without you," she said, her voice sincere. "You were there when I couldn't even see a way out. You showed me that I had the strength to keep going." Dr. Johnson shook his head gently. "You always had that strength inside you, Margaret," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I was just here to help you see it." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a sense of understanding. "I know," she said softly, "and I'll never forget that." The two of them stood in silence for a few moments, watching the sun set behind the trees, the orange and purple hues of the sky reflecting the quiet peace they had both found. For Dr. Johnson, this moment was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. It wasn't just about fixing broken bodies. It was about restoring hope. It was about showing people that, no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way forward. He had seen it in Margaret. He had seen it in himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly made a difference. "You're ready for whatever comes next, Margaret," Dr. Johnson said quietly, his voice full of belief. "I'm proud of you." She smiled again, her eyes shining with a quiet confidence. "Thank you, Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready." And as they stood there, the camp behind them, the world before them, Dr. Johnson knew that the journey they had started together had brought them both to a place of healing, a place where the past no longer defined them, but where the future was full of possibility. As the weeks passed, the transformation in Margaret was undeniable. Dr. Samuel Johnson had witnessed firsthand the physical and emotional healing she had gone through, and each day brought a new sense of strength and resilience to her. She was no longer just the fragile woman he had first met, the one who had carried the weight of her past like a shadow. Now, she was a woman finding her own way forward, a woman learning to reclaim her life and the world around her. Dr. Johnson had always believed that people had an innate ability to heal, But Margaret had proven to him that sometimes it wasn't just about the body. It was about the spirit. Her eyes, once clouded with fear and pain, now reflected a quiet confidence, the glimmer of hope that had been rekindled within her. She no longer seemed like a prisoner of war. She was becoming someone new, someone who had learned to forgive herself and embrace the possibility of the future. One afternoon, as Dr. Johnson arrived at the small tent where Margaret was staying, he found her sitting outside, basking in the warm sunlight. She looked peaceful, her eyes closed as she tilted her head toward the sky, as if savoring the simplicity of the moment. He stood there for a moment, watching her, before approaching her gently. "Hey, Margaret," he said softly, not wanting to disturb the serenity of the moment. She opened her eyes and smiled as she saw him. "Dr. Johnson," she said warmly, her voice light. "It's such a beautiful day. I've been sitting here just thinking." "I can see that," Dr. Johnson said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Thinking about what?" Margaret paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've been thinking about how far I've come," she said finally, her voice thoughtful but steady. "About how different I feel now compared to when I first got here. I didn't think I would ever be able to move past everything I had lost. But now I can see that I have a future." Dr. Johnson sat down beside her, feeling a quiet pride settle in his chest. "You've come a long way, Margaret," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. "And it's not just the physical recovery I'm talking about. It's the way you've changed, the way you've learned to believe in yourself again." Margaret looked at him, her expression softening. "I couldn't have done it without your help," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You helped me see that it wasn't too late for me. You helped me see that I still had the strength to rebuild my life, even after everything that happened." Dr. Johnson shook his head gently. "You did all the hard work, Margaret," he said with a smile. "I just gave you a little push in the right direction. But the strength to heal was always inside you. You just had to find it again." There was a long pause, a comfortable silence between them as they sat together, both contemplating how far Margaret had come. She had not only healed from the trauma of war, but she had also found the strength to look forward, to create a life for herself once again. "I've been thinking about my family, too," Margaret continued after a while, her voice filled with a quiet longing. "About what I've lost. But instead of feeling like it's all gone, I've started to think about the good memories, the things I loved about my life before the war. And it doesn't feel like they're gone forever anymore. I feel like I can carry those memories with me, like they're still a part of me." Dr. Johnson listened carefully, his heart aching for the pain she had gone through. But he could see it in her eyes. Margaret had reached a place of acceptance. She was no longer letting her past define her. "Those memories will always be a part of you," he said gently, "and they'll help guide you forward. You'll carry them with you, not as a burden, but as a source of strength." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm starting to believe that," she said quietly, "that the things I've lost aren't gone forever. They've shaped me into who I am today. And now, I'm ready to build something new." Dr. Johnson smiled at her, feeling a deep sense of pride in the woman she had become. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Margaret," he said, his voice full of belief. "And I know you're going to make the most of it." Margaret turned to him, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze kind. "You've done all the hard work, Margaret," he said. "I'm just glad I could be here to help you along the way." As they sat together in the quiet afternoon, the weight of the past seemed to fall away, leaving only the present and the promise of what was to come. Margaret had healed, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. She had found the strength to move forward, and now, as the sun set on the horizon, it was clear that her journey was just beginning. The camp was quieter now, the distant sounds of soldiers and machinery fading into the background as Dr. Samuel Johnson walked toward the small wooden cabin where Margaret had been staying. The journey that had begun months ago, with uncertainty and fear, had led them both to a place of understanding. For Margaret, it had been a journey from loss to recovery, from a woman who had been broken by the horrors of war to one who was now beginning to embrace life again. Dr. Johnson had seen it all, the fragility, the fear, the quiet strength that had slowly emerged in her as the days passed. He had watched as she went from a woman who had been afraid to believe in herself to someone who was now confident and ready to face whatever came next. It was a quiet, gradual transformation, but one that was as real as any physical healing. As he arrived at the cabin, he saw Margaret sitting outside, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The golden light of the late afternoon bathed the camp in a soft glow, and for a moment, Dr. Johnson simply stood there, watching her. There was something peaceful about her now, something that hadn't been there before. She had found peace, not just with her past, but with herself. Dr. Johnson, Margaret said as she looked up, her voice warm but steady. Good afternoon, Margaret, he replied, walking toward her. How are you today? Better, she said, her smile gentle but filled with a quiet strength. I've been thinking about everything, about what's come before, about what's next. Dr. Johnson nodded, understanding. It's a lot to think about, he said, his voice thoughtful. But you've come a long way, Margaret. I can see that in you. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a sense of calm confidence. It's strange, you know, she said, her voice soft but clear. For so long, I couldn't see a way forward. Everything I'd lost seemed like it was always going to be with me. The war, the pain, the emptiness. But now, it's like I can finally see that there's more. There's hope again. There's a future. Dr. Johnson felt a wave of pride swell within him as he listened to her words. He had known from the beginning that Margaret was stronger than she realized. He had seen it in her from the start, but now, hearing her speak those words, he knew that she had finally found her strength. She had come through the darkest times, not only surviving, but thriving. I'm glad you can see that now, Dr. Johnson said, his voice steady, filled with a quiet admiration. You've worked hard to get here, and I'm proud of you. She looked down for a moment, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her jacket, before meeting his gaze again. I couldn't have done it without you, she said quietly. Without your help, I don't know if I would have made it this far. Dr. Johnson shook his head gently, his smile soft. It was all you, Margaret, he said, his voice sincere. You found the strength to heal. I just helped guide you along the way. They both sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the sun surrounding them. Margaret had come a long way, and Dr. Johnson could see it. The woman who had first walked into his clinic, broken and fearful, was now standing tall, with a sense of purpose that had once seemed out of reach. She had found the will to live again. She had found hope. I've been thinking about what's next, Margaret said, her voice breaking the silence. About where I go from here. I've always been afraid of the future, afraid of what it would look like without everything I knew. But now I think I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to rebuild. Dr. Johnson nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. You've already started, Margaret. You've taken the first step, and the rest will come in time. She smiled at him, a smile that was filled with gratitude and understanding. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, she said, her voice full of sincerity. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed. You've given me the chance to start again. You gave yourself that chance, Dr. Johnson replied gently. I just helped you see it. As the day wore on and the sun sank lower in the sky, Dr. Johnson and Margaret continued to talk. They spoke about the future, about what lay ahead for her, and about the possibilities that had once seemed so distant. Margaret no longer saw herself as a victim of the war. She had moved beyond that. She had learned to see herself as someone who had the power to shape her own future. She had found the strength to move forward, not because the past didn't matter, but because she had learned to accept it. She had learned to carry it with her, without letting it define her. As the night began to fall, Dr. Johnson knew that Margaret's journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But he also knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her strength, her hope, and with those things, she could face anything the future had in store for her. And for Dr. Johnson, there was no greater reward than witnessing her find that strength and hope for herself.